Welcome back once again to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now today I have a very special guest lined up and I need to apologise to him before we even get him on the podcast today because I was a few minutes late due to one of those dreaded software updates that always come along when you least expect them or want them. Yes, it happens to us all. And today's guest is Steve Orrin. And he's enjoyed 3 decades of extraordinary success in a series of high-level roles in top-tier companies. And he is the federal CTO and senior principal engineer at the Intel Corporation. He orchestrates and executes customer engagements in the federal space, overseeing the development of federal solution architectures to address challenges in government enterprise, national security, and so many other federal areas of focus. And I don't think we talk about the challenges around the public sector enough. So that's one of the reasons I'm excited to get him on the podcast today. And when I read that he's dedicated himself and his vision as a leader by going into projects with an all-in attitude. So I've invited him on the podcast today where we're going to talk about everything from cybersecurity, the pressure that goes with putting a chip in 40 million different PCs, hybrid working, zero trust architecture, ransomware, and so much more. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to Washington, D.C., where you can join me and Steve in conversation. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Well, thank you, Neil, and a pleasure to be here today. So as you mentioned, I'm Steve Orrin. I'm the Federal Chief Technology Officer for Intel Corporation. And in that role, I drive all of our technology engagements, strategy, and solution architecture for the U.S. public sector and looking beyond as well. My background is in cybersecurity, having run multiple security startups throughout the 90s and 2000s. The last of my security startups, Sarvega, was acquired by Intel, which is how I came to Intel back in 2005. And then at Intel, I've had multiple roles, initially driving security pathfinding, sort of looking at that 2 to 5 year horizon of new security innovations that can be built on top of existing or future hardware, and then transition to the current role of federal CTO back in 2013 to help drive Intel's capabilities more broadly with the federal customer and really look at innovations that we can do across the public sector globally.
And if I was to take you back even further before Intel, can you remember the moment that, I don't know, where your passion for tech came from? It might have been a spark that ignited something in you, or just any moment at all that would eventually put you on the path you're on today?
Well, it's a very good question, Neil, because as a young child, I was always into sort of computers and hacking. I had 2 main loves. It was computers and biology. And when it came time to sort of pick a career back in the 80s, I went the bio route and started doing the MD, PhD, pre-med path. And then an opportunity arose sort of before I had to start med school to help a guy who had some ideas around doing a startup. This was 1995. And I looked at it as an opportunity to make a little money to help pay for med school. And I just fell in love. The technology industry was early. This was pre-Netscape IPO, the early days of internet. And we were trying to solve some really hard problems around email security. And so I dove headfirst into that. And after 3 months of sort of working on our first proof of concept and talking to customers about their problems and then trying to solve it, I just fell in love and never looked back. And from there, we started a company called Sendata that did email encryption. And then from there, just rolling thunder onto new startups and new interesting opportunities. But it was really at that point where the whole industry was young, everything was possible at that time, and still is in many cases. Even though we've grown to this huge industry we are today, it's solving hard problems has always been, for me, the hard part, or the interesting part that sort of drives me, is when a customer or an area of the industry has a big challenge, and you look at innovative or outside the box ways to go after trying to solve it.
And of course, that path would lead you to Intel. I mean, just saying that name will have that little jingle playing inside their head for people listening all over the world. And that's where things really got exciting. So can you tell me a little bit more about some of the areas that you've worked at with Intel?
Well, as you mentioned, Intel is a globally known brand. And I think one of the things that for me that was really interesting about my transition to Intel, and while as a serial entrepreneur, I've still been there now, going on 18 plus years, is the scale and scope of what the impact you can have. And so one of my most successful startups, we had 500 Fortune 1000 customers using our product, which is a big success. And we had a good exit. Everything was great. Um, the first project I worked on at Intel went into 40 million PCs.
Wow.
And so that's just the impact you have. And that's really been the excitement. And so the areas that I focused on, and it was really a really cool opportunity back in 2005, Intel had classically looked at sort of the 5 to 10 year horizon of new technology innovations from the chip design perspective in the labs. And then the product teams had, sort of a 2-year cadence of bringing new products to market once they were fully baked. There was this middle zone between the 2 to 5 year that really wasn't being well looked at from an innovation perspective. And the head of the software team at the time, Renee James, who went on to become president for a period of time of Intel, had this idea that we should do pathfinding. We should be looking at that sort of middle tier. And so she stood up a new division and tapped me to head the security part of that division to look at new innovations. And so, as I joked, I got to play, CTO of a startup with Intel's bank account.
I love that, but 40 million PCs in those early days, man, that is mouth-watering. And I suppose one of the things that you've seen throughout the years as well is the threat landscape continuously evolving. So from your work, what are you seeing as far as the latest threats and techniques that are being used against corporations, governments, users? In fact, it's a subject that touches each and every one of us, isn't it, wherever we are on whatever device we're on?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we're seeing some key trends, and then we're also seeing some tactics. The trends are that the adversaries, whether those be nation states or organized crime or hacktivists, are getting much more sophisticated, more so than they ever have been. Their infrastructure, the tools, the techniques they use are absolutely at the same class as the software defenders. They have quality assurance, they have support, they have software as a service models, they have business models. It's a $1 trillion market. And so part of what's behind that is driving the kind of innovations to do targeted attacks against organizations, whether that be targeted phishing, doing information gathering around a particular organization to be able to create real well-crafted targeted emails and targeted posts to try to get people to click on the link. I think in the last 2 years, one of the biggest new areas, although it's been around for some time, it really hit the news, is supply chain attacks. Yeah. And so these attacks are getting into the software and the services and the open source tools that are adopted by much of the ecosystem and are deployed at scale inside enterprises. And by compromising them as part of that initial development and build process, what's coming out the door looks and feels and acts like legitimate software until it does the nefarious thing it does once it gets into your systems. And from most of the security checks that the industry has adopted over the last 20, 30 years has always been, well, make sure you get software from legitimate sources. Make sure you know who you're getting your software from. Check the signature on the software. Make sure you're downloading from known sites if it's open source tools. Well, all of that doesn't help if the attacker got in behind the scenes. And so I think what we've seen with SolarWinds, with Log4j, with CodeCov, and these other attacks has been understanding a key weak spot that allows the attacker to get in through the back door, if you will. And then lastly, we can't talk about threats if we don't talk about ransomware, because ransomware literally is everywhere. And I think two things I learned over the last couple of years about that ransomware really highlighted. It highlighted, number one, that everybody is a target. And the best example of that was the JBS ransomware attack. And that was a meatpacking company in Australia that was one of the major providers globally of meat, got hit by a ransomware attack that took them offline. We learned really two important things. Number one, no one is immune, because it's not like they were a financial services company or they were a healthcare organization. I mean, I joke, you can't be any less sexy than meatpacking, but they were targeted. The other thing we learned is that everything is reliant on digital technologies, because you think of meatpacking as a very physical world kind of thing, but yet their whole supply line and their manufacturing process was taken down by a digital attack. And so every industry is reliant on their IT and OT technologies in order to run and operate the business. And so security threats, ransomware threats must be top of mind for not just the CIO, but for the CEO and the board, because it can have an impact on your day-to-day activities.
And it can almost feel like an impossible task because right now, hybrid working is all the rage. People expect, at the very minimum, to be able to work on any device in any country, on any network at any time during a period of growing tensions and global conflict. It's just a recipe for disaster if you were to zoom out. So I appreciate this is a big question, but what are some of the best practices or novel approaches that anyone listening could be doing to better protect themselves?
So it's a really good question, and I want to break it down into three areas. First and foremost, and it comes back to a little bit of the hygiene that I know a lot of security professionals talk about, but one of the challenges when they say, well, you just need better cyber hygiene, is that really doesn't address the issue, because we all know what we should be doing. We need to patch, we need to close firewall ports, we need to do active scanning. But really at the heart of hygiene are two things that aren't being done. And so the two best practices that we've seen successfully help organizations time and again, one is getting greater visibility into your infrastructure. And that's really good asset management because it's a key tenet that you can't secure what you don't know. And so having good idea of both the physical, digital assets, the software and services you're using, the networks and where they are, and of course the identity of both your users, your partners, and of the entities that are consuming those services. So visibility is crucial. One of the things we're seeing emerging is getting deeper visibility into the assets themselves. And this is, in response to the supply chain attacks with emerging standards like SBOM or software bill of materials. The ability to know what's inside that black box, what's in the software package, what is it made from, or what are the dependencies of that open source tool that we just downloaded to deploy at scale. Getting that level of visibility helps you better understand the risk posture within your environment, because now you have a better understanding of what's going on and what's there. So when a vulnerability or an exploit is reported, you have the ability to do a quick mapping between, well, this is the vulnerability, and I know here are the things that are affected. And then the other key thing that's really absolutely crucial, especially in the fact that no one has enough cybersecurity workforce to begin with, is that automation will set you free. And that is being able to automate what I call the 80-20 rule. Automate the 80% of the activities, whether it be automated patching, automated scanning, continuous monitoring, turn on the sensors and have them deployed at scale. Because automation will absolutely set you free and allow your workforce, which is already overworked and underfunded, to focus on the really hard things. So instead of having your really talented, expensive cyber workforce working on the standard cyber hygiene, you can have them doing the hunting, have them do the 20 or 10% of the really hard problems of tracking down those anomalies, doing forensics on things, or tracking the insider threats, and allow the systems and infrastructure that you've already deployed to work for you at scale. And so those two things are sort of foundational. And then when you start looking at what evolves a company from just doing the foundational things to really being operational, it's about having a good understanding of risk. And that is for a CISO and really for a CIO, that is at the forefront of how do you manage your security environment, is understanding what is your risk, what are the risk appetites, and what is your acceptable level of risk to take, because not every organization or even every project or business unit has the same level of risk. Some of them are mission critical to the corporation, some of them less so. And when you start looking at sort of the connected risk between organizations, it allows you to make better decisions about how to deploy your security controls. And ultimately, because we know we never can get 100% secure, it comes down to how do you apply your security time and energy and resources to the most critical things within your organization. And that's what risk management and cybersecurity risk frameworks allow you to accomplish, is be able to point those assets at the right places.
I love that line, automation will set you free, when talking about cybersecurity. And you mentioned a few moments ago about supply chains, and especially over the last few years, we're hearing more and more about those hacks and breaches. And as you mentioned, even the unsexy world of meatpacking has been impacted. So what is the main security risk concern around supply chain security, do you think? And what can organizations in that industry do today and indeed in the future to address and ultimately reduce risk?
So those are very good questions, Neil. Let's start with the first part, which is what is the security concern? And it really goes back to most software is delivered to organizations today as a black box. Whether you download it or you get it in a package, it is, you're buying, a word processor, you're buying a spreadsheet program, you're buying an enterprise ERP. You have apps from a technology perspective, you have absolutely no idea or very little idea what's inside the box. And so if there's a vulnerability or an active exploit, or there's a Trojan that's been inserted inside it, you have no way of knowing until it does something nefarious enough for your sensors to detect, or somebody else detects it and notifies the vendor, and then the vendor tells you. And so we're assuming or taking on a lot of risk in the industry for software that could be compromised or could be compromised in the future. And the challenge is that security tools and mechanisms we have aren't easily adaptable to being able to get deep visibility into those platforms. There are tools out there that will do binary analysis scans and will do full stack scans of open source tools. But even then, you don't really get all the information you need, and it's a laborious process. This is why initiatives like SBOM and other industry initiatives going around better practices in the development lifecycle and then documenting those artifacts to provide to customers really helps customers get a better understanding of the risk associated with different software products. The other key things that organizations do besides using that information is knowing when and where to use it. Oftentimes, when a new initiative like this comes out, it becomes a checkbox. It says, oh, we got an SBOM, check, let's go on and do the next phase of our process, as opposed to looking at that information and using it as part of your risk determination. One of the recommendations that we're seeing in some of the guidance out there is that you need to be able to verify your supply chain at multiple stages of the life cycle. And one of the really important ones that was focused on in some recent guidance is at the beginning of the acquisition process. So before you've even deployed the product or bought it, as you're vetting the software product using the supply chain information, whether it be an SBOM or organizational information or being able to do the scan of the open source environment before you make the determination to buy or to acquire, is using that information, supply chain risk management, as part of the acquisition process. That alone changes the dynamic. And so instead of assuming a lot of risk and then trying to mitigate it later, you're pushing that all the way forward so that you make better decisions up front. And then as you start to do the acquisition, the testing and the deployment and the maintenance, you've already got that supply chain risk management infrastructure in place to apply to the whole life cycle of a given product as it's deployed to the enterprise. What we see organizations starting to do, and it's still early days, we're seeing developers starting to do a better job of documenting their build process, verifying, and then providing documentation to the downstream ecosystems, their suppliers and the ultimate customer with deeper information about the products that they're deploying. And we're seeing customers start to ask those hard questions, get the information in. And I've even started to see sort of a cottage industry of small companies and other automation tools be able to take the SBOM document, the file, even though it's still an evolving format, and be able to parse it and apply the information to asset management databases, to vulnerability management systems. So we're seeing sort of a cottage industry spring up around the supply chain risk management lifecycle.
And at the very beginning of our conversation, I was talking about hybrid working, and it often feels, I think, now that the traditional approach of trusting everything inside of a corporate network and the actions of employees is just not realistic anymore. So as a result, zero trust is now top of mind these days for CISOs. But again, it's not as simple as just implementing that. There's a lot of complexities that can come with that kind of technology. So what advice can you give to organizations that are maybe looking to adopt zero trust architectures right now?
So Neil, you bring up a very good point, is that people are looking at zero trust to help address the new security environment. And I think one way to look at it is that zero trust isn't new. It's an evolution. It's the evolution from a risk-based approach and from an approach that's driven by risk into applying controls. What it does, it takes it that last mile, which is instead of making a risk decision and then implementing control and then moving on and have it being a binary. So, I've mitigated this onto the next thing. Zero trust really evolves that to a dynamic application of risk. And so it's a continuous monitoring, continuous policy evaluation, continuous validation. That it starts with a mindset. And that's why it's a zero trust architecture, a zero trust approach. It's not a zero trust product. There is no product that you can just throw in and magic, you have zero trust. But it is a way of thinking about how you apply your security controls. And then you start looking at the kind of controls that have that zero trust ability or give you those kind of utilization. Segmentation, so being able to better segment your network so that you can create these sort of enclaves of trust. And again, it's about how do I sort of separate everything from one big massive enterprise into knowable entities. Having security policy tied to the data not to the system that data resides on, because we understand now that data can be anywhere. It can be on your remote laptop, it can be in the cloud, and anywhere in between. And so having security policy follow the data as opposed to follow the system or follow the network. And of course, everyone talks about identity and access management, and identity is actually crucial. But two of the key things that we need to evolve identity is not just user authentication. It's not just Steve or Neil, but it's the context. So it's Steve or Neil on a particular laptop, in a particular geographic domain, on a particular network, accessing a particular service or asset. That credential, if you will, that is the idea of zero trust, is it's understanding the whole context of that access and applying a policy to it based on all of those parameters. And so as you're seeing what I'm describing here, it's not a particular technology, but it's the means by which you apply risk to the application of those security controls is how you start to achieve zero trust. And the successful organizations that are that are getting zero trust architectures deployed and taking a zero trust approach are doing just that. They're using their risk management to drive a dynamic policy set that implements controls throughout the organization, and it's never a one and done. They've built in systems to constantly evaluate, is that authentication correct for this moment in time, for this risk, or for this environment? So I may have authenticated in to get access to the network, but if I change what I'm doing, so I start accessing new resources, or I change my network, if anything about me changes, I automatically is being revalidated about whether or not that is considered to be an allowable activity.
And many people listening to this podcast today and our conversation, and indeed your customers from all over the world, from some of the biggest brands and household names in the world, they're going to be looking to Intel for help, for trends, for anything that can help and where the industry is heading. So on that side of things, what new security innovations are you seeing on the horizon, or what kind of thing is exciting you right now?
So I think there are three things that I see as really exciting, and one is here today and is available, and that is confidential computing. It's the notion that you can protect your data for what we call the last mile of data security. If you think about data security in the past, it's about data at rest and data in transit. So file encryption or full disk encryption, and then network transport encryption. The last piece of that puzzle that wasn't well addressed was data in use. How do I protect my data when it's in memory being processed by the transaction system? And so confidential computing is a new set of hardware and software capabilities to provide a encrypted, secure container for your data and for your application while it's being transacted on. We're seeing this deployed across all the cloud providers. It's in the hardware today. And that is one of the big game changers to really the final link, if you will, in how do you apply data security throughout all of the data lifecycle. Following from that is another capability, and it sort of stems from the notion of a confidential computing, but it goes much further, which is something called attestation. And that is back to that concept I talked about earlier about deeper visibility. How do I attest to the status of a particular data or transaction authentication all the way down to the environment and infrastructure it's running on, the network it's coming to me from, independent of everything else? And so be able to get those attestations so that I can trust the security infrastructure of a cloud provider, or trust the security infrastructure of a partner environment, and make better risk decisions. Those are the technologies that I see that are really here today and starting to be adopted at scale. When I look a little bit to the future of where I see a lot of promise, and there's a lot of startups and even big companies that are talking about the application of AI to cybersecurity, I think we have a long way to go, a couple of years before we see it truly realize the promise that we've hoping for around AI when it comes to cybersecurity. And it really comes into two camps. A lot of the focus today is on, well, I'm going to use AI to detect the malware faster, so it's better pattern matching, it's better anomaly detection, and that's an important piece. But that's just sort of the first wave or the tip of the iceberg of what AI can do. It's sometimes, you have to think about it, is instead of trying to detect the malware, which is always a cat and mouse game, looking at how AI can apply my security controls at scale so that it's not about detecting the malware, it's about locking down the vulnerability that the malware would have taken advantage of without having to detect it. And so using AI to get better situational awareness and better pattern of life matching to understand what is normal and what is abnormal, but also to apply security controls at scale. And that is the shift that I think we need to see on how AI can really drive benefit to the enterprise security, is where it's less about whack-a-mole on the latest malware that's flowing through the world, and more about how do I use AI to get operational efficiency? How do I use AI to help that automation of security controls and to get more dynamic and take humans out of the loop so that you get faster time to remediation, faster time to mitigation. And that's where I think some of the promise of operational scalable AI is really going to help the cybersecurity domain, is as we start to unleash it on our enterprise to help mitigate and remediate issues at scale and automated.
And we've talked about here how many of the businesses of the world are going to be looking to you to lead the way and identify trends and better ways of working, etc. But I'm curious, what keeps you up at night, and how do you keep your curiosity and open-mindedness alive to be more open to new solutions that might fix some of those problems keeping you up at night? Is there a secret there?
So I think there's two sides to that coin. What keeps me up at night? I think honestly, I think it's there's a lot of potential risk out there, and so it's the power grid or taking out critical services. And the fragility of many of those systems and really interconnectivity. I think when you look at security, a lot of people sort of focus on the things. I can protect the grid. I can protect the water treatment plant. I can protect the services in the cloud. But it's that's the seams, the integration points, where I think there's a lot of vulnerability that worries. The power grid is reliant on other systems to be able to help manage and control those. So sometimes it's not the power grid that gets taken out, but maybe the cooling systems that are cooling the generators. And so suddenly you've got a cascading effect. And so understanding the interdependencies, and I think there's not enough focus on that interdependency. So that's one of the things that does keep me up at night, is just how interconnected we are as a world. And what happens in one place can have a drastic impact elsewhere. Sometimes, it's referred to as the butterfly effect. And how do I keep my curiosity and how do I keep myself fresh? I think it's I'm constantly learning. I want to as a hacker at heart. I want to play with things. I want to get access to the new technologies and open them up and see how they tick, and just keep reading, listening to podcasts, and just sort of listening to people talk about what their research is and finding out new and interesting ways. I spent a day recently learning about silicon photonics, and it's just an exciting area of innovation of bringing photonics directly into the chip. And that is going to change the game as far as how fast we can process everything from networks to high-performance computing to signal acquisition in the 5G world. There's a lot of these sort of base technologies that are going to really open the door to whole new ways of doing things, to AI at scale. And so some of these really cool innovations that we're seeing are really the thing that keeps me excited.
Silicon phonetics. I love that. I feel like saying Great Scott like Doc Brown in Back to the Future there for a moment. But of course, we started the podcast talking about your origin story, what put you on this path. And as we come full circle, I'm going to ask you to leave everyone listening with either a book that has inspired you throughout your career, or that we can add to our Amazon wish list, or a song we can add to our Spotify playlist. All I ask is, what are you going to leave us with? And is there a story or reason behind that choice?
Sure. So I think the book that has inspired me, and it was introduced to me early in my career, is the book by Jim Collins, Good to Great. Yeah. My CEO at one of my startups actually knew Jim and had him come in and give her executive team a talk. And the precursor to coming in was that we all had to read the book. And at the time, I'm like, I don't want to read a business book. I have to tell you, it was one of the best reads I've ever had, because it just gave me some really good insights, both into how businesses, especially successful ones, but even unsuccessful ones, how they operate or how they had dysfunction, because it identifies some of those key things of understanding how businesses work. And then the other part of what, when you look at how good businesses operate, it taught me a lot about how I, as a manager and executive, need to operate, and about surrounding yourself with people smarter than yourself and making sure that you're listening to the minority reports. And so I think, Good to Great, and then, of course, Built to Last that followed it, were key books that taught me so much about how myself need to operate and be successful, but also as I look at businesses and organizations, within my company and broadly around the world, it gives you a unique way of looking at them to say, well, how are they operating, and are they operating at the right scale that they should be? What is their business really about? Because when you look at cybersecurity and you're talking about what is the most mission critical thing for your organization, step one is understanding what is your business. I mean, one of the best examples was Walmart in the book is Walmart is a logistics company. You think they're retail, but really they're about the logistics of getting product onto the shelves and being able to understand the logistics. And so that's their most mission critical system. And so it's that little insight into knowing what's most important to an organization gives you the insight to better help them or better help yourself.
Wow, absolutely love that. I'll add that straight to our Amazon wish list. And for anyone listening that wants to dig a little bit deeper on anything we talked about today, I appreciate Intel is a huge website, but if there is any way you'd like to point them to, or best way of contacting your team, etc., especially around cybersecurity issues, where would you point everyone?
So the best way to get information on what we're doing, especially in the public sector, is intel.com/public sector. Yeah. And that will take you to the site that has a lot of great content on cybersecurity, on AI, on enterprise cloud modernization. So really all the different technologies that governments around the world are looking to adopt or challenged with dealing with. And so that's great starting point. And then to find out more about what I'm doing, just find me on LinkedIn at, it's linkedin.com/ I believe it's Cypher Steve.
Awesome.
Or Soren. I have to go look it up. I think it's Twitter, Cypher Steve. It's SORRIN on LinkedIn.
Well, I'll add links to both of those so people can find you nice and easily. But just a big thank you for taking the time to sit down with me, share your very personal origin story there. We've covered everything from inserting chips in 40 million PCs and the responsibilities that will go with that, hybrid working, the global conflict, ransomware, and how automation will set you free in cybersecurity. And I think we also flirted a little bit with silicon. Is it photonics? Is that right?
Yes, silicon photonics.
That's my homework for this evening. I'm going to be checking that out. But more than anything, just thank you for sitting down with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Neil.
What a great guy. And he's left me with a few things to look up there and learn more about, such as confidential computing and silicon photonics. And it's another great reason why I record this podcast every day, because I get to learn something from an amazing person located somewhere in the world. And for me, technology works best when it brings people together, and that is exactly what this show is all about. And I hope that if you're listening to this podcast going for a walk with your dog, or going for a run, or in the gym, or doing some chores, or in the office. In fact, I'd love to hear more about what you're doing as you listen to this podcast. Is it on the commute, or is it somewhere completely different? I'd love to hear where you're listening and when you're listening. So, as always, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, TikTok, all the usual suspects. Just look for @NeilC.Hughes. That's me. We'll keep this conversation going. And I also cordially invite you to come and join me again tomorrow, where we've got another great guest lined up, and we'll once again explore a different industry of how it's being transformed by technology. So finally, just a big thank you for listening as always, and until next time, don't be a stranger.